also Taiwan, both apply to CPTPP. And besides original member, United Kingdom, after the Brexit, United Kingdom apply, and then successfully he is now the member. UK is now a member of CPTPP. This is a good thing. Therefore, that this is a new phenomenon. And also on the set of the CPTPP, there's a digital trade, also that digital trade, because this is a new type of the frontier. And then the CPTPP and the digital asset is very coincident. And then, well, those groups, and because of the initiative of Singapore and also that Chile, that the data traffic is also that now going to expand based on the rule of the CPTPP. And then, so the private sector is really needs those kind of framework of free to ensure that free trade of goods and services and data and capital. And then my sense is, for example, that many years ago, China is also be a member of WTO, and also that in IMF, that especially during like SDR, the currency, the renminbi is also be a part of SDR component. However, there's no sign of the increase of the renminbi. So for example, that central bank's reserve, foreign reserve, renminbi's share is very small because the people in like-minded countries do not trust China. Therefore, renminbi is not anymore. That's also China now now almost they change the course. They gave up some idea to be internationalization of renminbi in a normal course. But now China more shifted to that digital renminbi. So it's a new. So that will discuss later. But obviously that group like CPTPP or those framework for private sector is vitally important.
Thank you. So we also have a couple of Europeans on the panel, or at least a European and someone who's lived in Berlin for the last 20 years, as we were just talking about, and who works on China, works on economic security issues. So I want to bring the European focus into this conversation a little bit. And Noah, I want to start with you. You have a whole newsletter dedicated to how China and Europe are not necessarily working together, but how China interacts with Europe and how the economic relationship between the two is developing and has developed through the years. So how is Europe sort of responding or conceptualizing this idea of economic interdependence or economic weaponization, both at a member state level, but also at a supranational EU level? And are we looking, I mean, is this really just a China problem we're talking about here?
I'd say it's mainly a China problem. Okay. I'm going to come out and say that. There is now a debate in Europe. We're at the very beginning of this debate about de-risking from the US. I think this is mainly rhetorical for now. We're not seeing a lot of action on that front. That could come. We'll have to see. The European Commission, I think, has been in the lead on this issue. They define economic security along 3 pillars: promote, protect, and partner. I think promote is about industrial policy and helping companies boost innovation and removing regulation. That's also a big debate in Europe right now. Partner is about free trade deals, diversifying trade. We have like the EU-India deal that was recently announced. I think the protect side is probably the most contentious. The European Commission announced an Industrial Accelerator Act recently, which is about introducing local content rules. It's about conditioning FDI. And this has been the subject of a very, very intense debate in Brussels. Trade defense is also quite contentious. We went through a very politically divisive debate in Europe about imposing tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. And so this is something that member states are wrestling with. I guess the other thing to say here is that, you know, this is a new world in the sense that governments have to do things that they haven't been used to doing in recent decades. I liken it a bit to a pilot who has learned to fly a plane on autopilot. Now it's violent turbulence and the autopilot is not working anymore. And governments, but also companies, have to take control, manual control of the plane to prevent it from crashing. And I think some people are hoping the autopilot will go back on. Some people are overwhelmed by all the blinking lights and the buttons in the cockpit. So governments, this is very complex stuff. I think we see that with the issue of critical raw materials.
India Premium Economy, boarding now.
I don't walk, I cruise. I don't sit, I lounge. I feel fresh. Hot beans bring a smile. I've found my place in the sky.
And for some, this comes a bit more naturally. I would say in Japan, there's a bit of a history of this. Where I am in Germany, I think we're struggling a bit to get that balance right.
I don't want to put you on the spot, but are Germany struggling to get the balance right? Are there any states within Europe who you look at and say they're getting this right and we should look at them as maybe a model to emulate?
Well, I always say that the Dutch or the Japanese of Europe, when it comes to economic security, I think they were very early in recognizing this issue, mainly because of the role of ASML and the pressure that they came under from the US to restrict the export of semiconductor manufacturing equipment to China. So I think the Dutch have moved to put economic security at the very top of the agenda. And you see that if you look at the Dutch ministries, there's economic security people everywhere.
Stormy, I want to come to you. You know, we've diagnosed some of the problems that we're facing here, and I know you've kind of talked about some potential solutions, and I want you to build those out. But I also want to ask you specifically. You know, I spend a lot of time thinking about what the EU was created for, and what it needs to do today, and what that transformation looks like, and how difficult it is. You know, and I look at sort of through the lens of the EU being a security actor, something that it was never meant to be. It was always created as this like normative power. In this age of, you know, economic fragmentation, multilateralism, economic coercion, does this mean that the EU itself needs to be more of an actor in this space rather than a body that is acted upon? And how do you think it is faring in that quest thus far?
Well, thank you so much for this really pertinent question and for also having us here today discussing these issues. I think before I hop into answering those multitude of questions which you just posed, what I always find helpful is just also to conceptualize a little bit what we are talking about. So this panel is about resilience and it's about economic security. And not always do we understand the same thing when we talk about these issues. So just to share my thoughts with you, what I think resilience is, it means identifying the risks which we are confronted. And those risks are changing, and the interpretation and the awareness for it is changing. And that is something which is changing in the EU, and this is also something which is changing in Germany. For a long time, we believe that economic interdependence, trade, finances, would lead to democratic change, would lead to stability, would lead to peace. And this comes from our own historical experience, from what we experienced within the European Union, but also with partners. And Russia's invasion of Ukraine was the latest hard awakening for us. So the perception of geoeconomic risks is, I would say, changing. The second phase is then the preparation phase. So how do you deal with those risks in a better way? And I'm going to come to that in a second when I share a little bit my thoughts about economic instruments and political instruments. Then it's how to manage the crisis, and then also how to bounce back from the crisis and transform your economy or your political system or international institutions to better deal with the situation. And I think we are not there at all yet. So we are still kind of in the evaluation phase, a little bit in the preparedness, dipping our toe into the management, but by way no are we in the transformative phase. With regard to economic security, I think what we need to differentiate a little bit is security of the economy and security through economic means. It is very closely related to each other, but it's a little bit different. So when we talk about the security of the economy, we are talking about how to prepare against natural disasters, how to buffer against political shocks, how to deal with a financial economic crisis, and so on. A lot of geopolitics feed into this, but it's or how to buffer against cyber attacks. But how to make your economy and your economic system safe against shocks. Security with or through economic means is what we have also in the panel description, the coercive part, using your economic power, your economic, leverage, what you have to achieve political goals. And that is something which we have seen over the last few years, and it's something new, and it's harder to react to, especially for the European Union, which feels very uncomfortable with the idea to use your own economic means to achieve political goals somewhere else. So even if you're confronted with coercive power from abroad, this is what we are really struggling with. How can we use, or should we use, or to what extent should we use our own economic means, material power, so to say, to counter this coercive action? And to come to back to the different options or what's on the table for the EU, I would always say start at home. Look at your own common market, because there's a lot of power in the common market, but also still lots of barriers, regulatory barriers. We're still not one full market, so you have to get rid of these to utilize, to realize a lot of economic possibilities. Then, as Noah said, partnerships around the world, really important, diversifying supplies, but also markets. But then also thinking about the defense instruments. Are they sufficient? And are we willing to use them? And do we have the joint willingness in the EU to also accept and deal with the internal costs that might create, and also might create different costs to different EU member states. And that's what makes it so hard, because if we use the anti-coercion instrument, for example, it's going to hit the different EU member states differently. And we need to deal with the solidarity aspect of, buffering ourselves against coercion from abroad.
So I'd like to just give the panelists a chance, if there's anything that you've heard that you want to jump into and respond to before I get into my second round of questions. I just wanted to offer you a chance to do that, or I will just hit you again with a whole other round. Okay. So I'd like to start at the end again, because we talked specifically here about Europe's role in a increasingly economically fragmented world. How is India conceptualizing its role?
How is India visualizing its role?
Yeah, exactly.
Look, I think obviously India is somewhere between being an independent node and a swing power on its own. So at the moment, there are areas of strength and also areas of vulnerability for India, given its massive energy dependence and also dependence on capital flows. That kind of circumscribes some of the autonomy that India would like to have. But that being said, given its massive consumption power and a rising middle class and a huge domestic demand size, it has got certain levers as well to play. So I think India is right now in the position of having to build up its own resilience first before it can become a player that influences global value chains and being able to not only resist coercion, but also make itself indispensable in certain global value chains. So there is much work to be done. I think India's attractiveness lies in the fact that it has maintained economic relationships with all major nations, and therefore, as a country, which has a very good economic growth potential and outlook going forward, and that has been sort of vindicated by the post-COVID track record. India's market size is its huge attractiveness for other nations, and therefore it is important for India to use that as an opportunity to make itself resilient in several areas. Only then it can move on to the next stage of where it's able to influence the flow of global commercial activity and economic activity.
Tadashi, I'd like you to jump in on this part as well, kind of not looking at India's role specifically, but sort of keeping it in the Indo-Pacific region. I mean, Noah sort of answered this question about whether or not this is a China problem, and I'd like you to touch on that as well. I mean, do you think that the frameworks, the Indo-Pacific economic frameworks, are enough and strong enough to resist fragmentation or resist pressure? And what does that resilience look like? What should both the private sector and partnerships with the government be looking like both now and into the future?
Well, we have a long kind of experience on that Chinese blackmail and the threat and weaponization, especially in 2011. After that nationalization of the Senkaku Islands, with Okinawa Prefecture, besides that, in anti-Japan protests, more than 500 protests. Boycott for Japanese product, and and also put a ban on the rare earth element export to Japan, and also they detained that businessman, so that this is a Chinese style. But I think that their behaviors remain unchanged. However, that after that. Testimony of the Prime Minister Takaichi's diet on the Taiwan Strait, China also got very furious, and then put the ban on, not ban, but self-constraint of group tourists to Japan, and cancelled that flight. But they did not overreact and compare with the 2012, at 11-12. There are no boycotts, no protests. Because the Chinese economy is a very fast shape, and a lot of Chinese people get very frustrated with a communist party, only communist party position right now. So for the Xi Jinping, the third term. So and also what they are doing right now because of a problem of the overcapacity of many. For example, that BID's EV, they are deeply discounted sales. By deeply discounted by incentive by government of China. Also that they put a ban on the critical mineral export to the specific companies like a Mitsubishi Heavy Industry or IHI, those using the relationship with the defense industry. There's new style, but the style remains unchanged. Therefore that we need to, we have already long term from making an effort to let's reduce the dependency of supply chain from China, especially the critical minerals. And then not just only the critical mineral ore, also that's smelting, processing, all supply chain. We need, not Japan only is not able to do it. We need partners and allies and like-minded countries to work together. So, for example, that we encouraging the Japanese companies and also that Geoeconomic as well to be a shareholder of Linus, which is an Australian company, and then the processing critical mineral outside China, mainly in Malaysia, and then going to the United States right now. So this effort is continue since 2011. So that's something, some success we already brought, but so far not perfect yet. So 3 years ago, the promised harvest times, and then we introduced a new Economic Security Promotion Act, and then that we recognize that the resilience of the key sectors, and also that they protect our key technology, indispensable technology. But now, 3 years later, we're going to be not just only defensive, but also be offensive. We're going to create more offensively, more proactively, to be engaged with our like-minded countries and to build up a new kind of supply chain of the key technology, digital, and critical mineral. These are very important, so that this is inspired by the Chinese action.
Stormy, I think you wanted to hop in as well. Yeah, go ahead.
Just wanted to quickly pick up on this. I do agree that it is very much a China problem, but not only, obviously.
Gonna get to that.
I know. What I wanted to say is that we are currently living in a period of paradigm change. From a liberal economic order to a more realist economic order. And that is pushed by not just China, but many countries around the world. And if you look at I would say 3 pillars of paradigm change, it's the narrative one, it's the instrument, and it's the institutional. And we can see it in this conference. I was here 5-6 years ago. This panel would have been discussed the issues a lot differently, and the phrasing and the framing and the narrative has changed a lot. And that is also, we also have a different narrative and framing in the EU now on these issues. We see it around the world, and rightly so. We also see a paradigm shift in the instruments which we use. Not that all the instruments are new, but they are more massively used, like the trade defense, export controls, investment screening, and many others. So they are definitely on the rise. And I think we also have an institutional change that within international institutions, power politics, and also national security considerations play a bigger role. And that is driven by lots of countries around the world. So if you look at the last WTO report, for example, and you see the numbers, how many countries are drawing on the national security exemption, it's a lot of countries. So I would say it is something which comes from a few, but being picked up, and things are also now doable, which weren't doable or justifiable a few years ago.
Just one more thing I wanted to ask you about. I can't let the United States off the hook just because I'm from there. So I wanted to ask you about the role that the U.S. has played in the topic we're discussing today. And please, anyone else on the panel is welcome to jump in on this also. It seems like the state that built the interdependent and foundational economic order that we benefit from today is now the one that is simultaneously fragmenting it and pulling it apart. And so is fragmentation just inevitable at this point? In your opinion, and is that partially driven by actions taken by the United States?
Well, I mean, it is driven also by the United States. I mean, with all the tariffs implemented last year and all those uncertainties and insecurities right now. But I hope that, I mean, while fragmentation takes place, that we do find ways to stabilize the international rules-based order, because it's so important for our prosperity around the world, and especially for smaller states. The WTO ministerial is just around the corner, end of this month. And while this organization is flailing, so to say, with regard to rule setting, enforcement, and also dispute settlement, there are also ideas on the table how to move forward with plurilateral agreements, for example, for investment facilitation, for example, or for digital trade, or also for some environmental issues. And there are a lot of countries who are actually still interested in a rules-based order and who would like to move forward on those plurilaterals. Unfortunately, there's still a consensus principle which impedes this. So I think that would be a great signal around the world. End of this March, end of this month, let's move forward of these initiatives among the countries of the willing who still fight for a rules-based order.
Rachel, I just wanted to come in here. When we talk of the rule-based international order that many Western voices invoke as a framework worth preserving, we have to recognize the fact that that order itself was not neutral to start with. It did embed existing power asymmetries, and it granted de facto veto to the strongest players and also extended great benefits to those who helped design it. So the existing order was not something from a developing country perspective particularly worth preserving. Therefore, any disruption is actually an intermediate stage to hopefully evolving something that is fairer and more symmetric than asymmetric.
No, thank you. That's an excellent point. And thanks for bringing that into the discussion. Hayden, yep.
Maybe if I can just add as well, just more generally around, we talked earlier on about economic resilience and economic security. For us, we also see that as operational resilience as well, that, the global financial system, the risk of fragmentation we talked about, we also need to guard against the possibility, of having, different systems which are not resilient. And we need to make sure that there is that trust, that security, and that control, and around data and governance of the financial system as well. I think we need to bear that in mind as well as we think through some of these issues, that the global financial system is very much about trust and security.
Yeah, Noah.
No, I just wanted to add the point that, following up on your question about the US, I think to have these discussions, whether it was about semiconductor supply chains or critical raw materials, we are seeing the Trump administration is not known for its multilateral approach. We are seeing some signs that the U.S. is waking up to the idea that, or this administration is, that cooperation on rare earths, critical raw materials is necessary. So there have been a series of meetings in Washington now, and I hope that this is perhaps a sign of things to come in the coming years. I think there is a huge need for India, Japan, Europe, the U.S. to cooperate on these economic security issues. They're hugely complex. And they require, as I said earlier, governments and companies to sort of rethink the way they rewire themselves in how they deal with these challenges. So I just wanted to emphasize that point, that in order to create the scale needed to respond to China, we really need more of this cooperation, not less.
Thank you. So we have about 10 minutes left, and I'd like to bring in the audience for questions. We have our Raisina Young Fellows over here on the right. And so, ma'am, I'd like to start with you. Just since we don't have very much time left, just keep it pretty quick and make sure it ends in a question. Thanks. Off over to you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Ludovica, and I'm part of the Young Fellow program, and I'm Italian, and I work for an Italian think tank. So my question is for Mr. Burki. And in the past year, we have heard a lot about the risking, the coupling, friendshoring, and in particular, friendshoring holds considerable promise for mitigating risk and dependencies in key areas that are the semiconductor industry, EVs, as well as the critical minerals. But yet, as 2026, we still see that progress for the EU remain limited. And for example, we can mention the EU-Australia MOU on the critical minerals. So my question is, drawing on your experience and expertise on EU, China, as well as the transatlantic relation, do you think this approach, so the risking, could be actually effective to improve the EU competitiveness, also considering the Draghi reports and everything that's been stressed from it?
Thank you.
And yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. That was to Stormy, or is that to Noah? Okay, yeah.
Was that to me? Yeah. That's how I understood it, but maybe I was wrong.
You should both touch on, please.
Okay. I think de-risking is hard enough when you're one country. When you're 27 countries, it's much harder. You need to reach a consensus on some very complex issues. So I think Europe, let's be honest, has struggled with de-risking. I don't think a lot of de-risking has gone on. We've had a lot of strategy documents, a lot of communications on this, but I think the need to the implementation hasn't really been there, and that's partly because the EU it can be a cumbersome beast. So I actually think we need to think about some fundamental reform in Europe to make Europe more nimble, less reactive, and I think, I've had some conversations just in the past days on this with various European officials. I think there are two ways forward. One is to hand over more competencies to the European Commission. I don't detect a lot of appetite for that in the big European capitals these days. And the other option is for a core group of states, Germany, France, Netherlands, Poland, Italy, Nordic countries. I see a Swedish friend there, so to push ahead and develop an agenda and a coalition of the willing to push ahead on some of these economic security issues. I don't think we're there yet. I think Germany and France right now are having trouble getting on the same page on some of these big issues. But Europe has to become faster and nimbler.
Thanks. If I may also just briefly jump in here, I'm personally not a great fan of the concept of friendshoring, because who's your friend today might not be your friend tomorrow, who knows. But diversification of sources and also supply and markets, sales markets is really important. So I mentioned earlier on that deepening the EU and deeper integration is a very important aspect of increasing resilience. There's a really great study by the IMF which quantified the internal barriers in terms of what it would mean as a tariff. So for goods, the tariff amount those regulations come to would be a 40% 40 tariff. And for services, it's 110. So we're not talking about 10 or 50, and that is massive. So getting rid of those different regulations, regulatory barriers would be a great start to increase resilience. Another issue is enlargement. So that doesn't mean necessarily always needs to mean like getting the countries, other countries like the Western Balkans completely into the EU, but deepening integration, economic integration with those countries is also a great way to increase resilience, and then functional partnerships. I mean, the EU has resource partnerships, which work so-so, I would say, so far. And I think we need to revisit some of those functional partnership ideas to make them also a lot more attractive to partners, and also ensure that there is actually technology, investment transfer, and everything else which is promised through those partnerships, which yet has to deliver. So I think there are lots of different instruments. Some of them work, some of them not so well, and we need to revisit what we can make better.
Thanks. We have room for 2 more questions. That's it. So please just be quick, and then I'll come up to the panel for final thoughts. Sir, over to you.
Hi there, I'm Aaron Pinto. I lead the Government of Ontario's Trade and Investment Office at the Canadian Consulate in New York, and I'm one of the Raisina Young Fellows. For decades, integration and global supply chains have been the pathway for development and growth. But in a world that's moving more towards economic security and reshoring, what happens then to countries like middle powers and smaller ones that have been heavily reliant on export-led growth? Thank you.
And the second question.
Many thanks. Economic security, pursuing this policy will also require changes in how businesses act. And my question would be, how do we best incentivize them to make the right choices, and how do you create predictability?
Sorry, can you speak into the microphone a little bit more so we can hear you? Thanks.
Yes, of course, sorry. My question would be, economic security also requires changes to the way businesses conduct their day-to-day activities. How do we best incentivize them to do it, and how do we create predictability for them?
Is that to someone specific that you want? Okay. Okay, maybe just really quick, please quick.
Yeah. My question is very short actually. Is World Trade Organization becoming utopian organization?
What?
To deal with resilience, because India is suffering, having trade crisis with European countries as well as USA, Canada.
Thank you. So I might just start at the end and then come to Tadashi and then Hayden, and then we'll go ahead and.
So on the first question, if I'm not mistaken, the question is how do small nations dependent on exports take care of their economic security or economic growth in these current circumstances? I mean, it's a very important question, but there are unfortunately no easy answers. So they are going to find themselves at the sort of the wrong end of the scale in terms of being able to maintain growth, because they don't have domestic demand to fall back on. And therefore they have to choose, unfortunately, which block to align themselves with, because if they choose to be neutral across blocks, which is a possibility, but increasingly they are being compelled to choose between blocks. So like in every policy decision, it's a trade-off that they have to exercise as to which one is a relatively better bet for them. That is a cold reality. They would benefit from a much more open order, but that is not going to be the case. That kind of feeds into the last question, whether WTO is a utopian organization, etc. One of the few, or probably the only multilateral institution that was based on equal voting rights was WTO. And that could be one of the reasons why it has been somewhat dysfunctional, because developed countries used to asymmetric voting rights couldn't quite accept the symmetric voting rights that were embedded in WTO. And that could be one of the reasons that has made it somewhat dysfunctional in nature. So I think from a developing country perspective, it is important to preserve the WTO, because it is the only organization that gives them equal rights. But that said, it is a reality that the world will be moving towards plurilateral structures rather than multilateralism, because developed countries do not find it now advantageous to continue with the existing multilateral order. That's a reality that developing countries also have to get used to.
Well, I was invited in 2023 and 2024 by Slovenian government to BRIC Strategic Forum. And then only out of former Yugoslavia, only the Slovenia and Croatia, the member of the European Union. The other countries like Serbia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Albania, and so those countries are put in a waiting list. And it takes more than 5 to maybe 10 years. Though that's I feel that's frustration of those countries, that they not able to speak, and also that they demonstrate the solidarity among the region. So that with or without European Union framework, I believe that Japan is now outreaching to those countries by means of the initiative to make a capital fund to make the investment in countries, no members or members, I don't care. So that we are now able to provide some capital to those countries to be engaged with those countries. That's one issue. Two is that China also try to outreach to the global south countries by means of Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SCO. And then, countries now the member of this or observers of Shanghai Cooperation Organization, they have many different interests, not the same interest. India try to neutralize that views of China using this Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and Iran, for example, Iran is also the member. So that we are not invited because we are G7 countries.
Thank you.
But probably that we need to pay attention to the movement of the growing global south. And I had a chat with Ajay Banga, the president of the World Bank, and then he is also keen on a role of the World Bank and of multinational organization to be bridges.
Thank you. So our time is up, but do you want to just end on a high note here pretty quickly? Because
very, very briefly, I think it's important to think about, as we talked about the different countries needing to be involved. That from Swiss point of view, we are a globally inclusive organization, and whether you're a small country, a small economy, or a large economy, having that connectedness and that cooperation is vital.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking our panel for an excellent discussion.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. And of course, thank you to the speakers and the moderator. If I could invite you to the top of the stage for a photograph. We'll now break for lunch, and along with that, a few housekeeping announcements as well. Those who have lunch invitations to specific rooms, please make your way there. If I can request everyone to please settle down and please avoid crowding the doors. If I can request my colleagues to just ensure that the exit movement is a bit smoother. Excuse me. I will request everyone to settle down, but Rachel, please carry on with the conversation, and I'm sure they'll settle down in time. Thank you. Start.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the third and final day of the Raisina Dialogue 2026. I can tell we're sort of in a transition moment here, but that's okay. I think we'll go ahead and get started because we have about 55 minutes and a lot of interesting discussion to be had, including a little bit of audience participation as well. So today, we are going to talk about, in short, weaponized interdependence. So looking at the global economy, which has long been underpinned by growing interdependence, open trade, it now faces a pretty stark paradox. You have mechanisms that are necessary for prosperity, things like integrated supply chains, things like cross-border investments, tech flows, market access, all of those things are now being used as instruments of economic coercion and punishment as well. So things like economic resilience and security are now at the forefront of policymaking, driven by disruptions from trade breakdowns, energy price volatility, and more. And much of this has been driven by China's willingness to weaponize dependencies and this has sort of accelerated this entire shift. China has had a head start in dealing with things through state-funded capitalism, domination of supply chains, and the rest of the world is sort of trying to catch up in real time, trying to build the plane as we fly it, as you might say. So I think today we want to look at how to preserve a stable and prosperous global economic order, or ultimately the tools that we use through this defensive quest for resilience will end up building a more fragmented world at the end of the day. So our panelists have already been announced, so I want to go ahead and get straight to the conversation. Anantha, I'd like to start with you to kind of scene set for us here, give us a broad overview on how you're looking at these issues. Are we seeing the weaponization of the global economic order?
Thank you, Rachel. Yeah, so I think the short answer to your question, whether we are seeing the weaponization of the global economic order, the short answer is yes. But I don't think this is a recent phenomenon. To some extent, the seeds of those were sown in the first decade of the millennium, starting with the accession of China into WTO, followed by the global financial crisis, when developed countries adopted unconventional monetary policies, etc., which transferred some of the pain to developing countries. And then we had the weaponization of trade and technology starting sometime around 2018. So what you have been seeing is a gradual accumulation of these weaponization, sometimes stated, sometimes unstated, but it has been in the works. So, and this is the phase that we have to go through before we re-emerge with a different set of order later.
So you said this is a phase that we have to go through before we emerge. Emerge into what exactly?
That is obviously somewhat difficult right now to delineate as to how and what shape would it be. And it might be, in fact, we may still be in the early stages of this dismantling of the old order. Therefore, to imagine and visualize, it will be more, I think at this stage, it will be more in terms of specific blocks, more plurilateral rather than multilateral. And in fact, I would say, the process of integration lasted roughly about 40 years, although it began right after the end of World War II. But therefore, the process of fragmentation may also have to last a bit longer. In everything, usually, humans have to reach a point of maximum disgust with the existing order before they go on to a new one. Therefore, we have to reach a point of maximum disgust with fragmentation, which has just commenced about 10, 15 years earlier. And therefore, it's a long way off before we can even reimagine how the new arrangement will look like.
Hayden, with that, I'd like to come over to you. You're part of a global financial organization, SWIFT. And I think historically, when we look at alliances, when we look at partnerships, those alliances and partnerships have been between states and state actors. And I think what we are seeing, especially over the last 5, 10, 15 years, is increasingly private sector and non-state actors sort of driving new partnerships and new alliances. So what are you seeing in terms of these new partnerships and new alliances emerging as a quest for economic security? Are we being sort of driven by these new partnerships toward a world of economic multipolarity?
Well, thank you for the question. So for SWIFT,
सिस्टर बीना का मैसेज आया है अर्जेंट लिखा है मेरे बच्चे के ट्रीटमेंट के लिए 1 लाख रुपए चाहिए डॉक्टर तुरंत भेज दीजिए प्लीज
सिस्टर बीना मैं पहले सिस्टर बीना को फोन करके पूछूंगी फिर भेजूंगी क्योंकि मैं मूर्ख नहीं हूँ
वेल डन डॉक्टर यूपीआई कहता है अगर पहचान के व्यक्ति से भी ऐसे मैसेज आए तो हो सकता है कि उनके मैसेजिंग ऐप हैक्ड हो तो पहले नॉर्मल कॉल करके चेक करो और कहो मैं मूर्ख नहीं हूँ जाइए आप भी किसी का टेस्ट लीजिए
it's about keeping that interoperability to make sure that the world is connected. That's one of the key driving aims that we see because there are risks around fragmentation which will have, we believe, knock-on effects for the global economy. And we carried out some research with The Economist a while back, which looked at the financial cost of fragmentation. And that predicts that there could be, in a worst case scenario, 1 to 6% drop in world GDP from financial fragmentation. So we believe that's something which we should guard against and make sure that we continue to have that interoperable global system.
And when you talk about economic fragmentation, are you essentially talking about sort of multiple parallel economic systems that end up sort of competing against each other rather than with each other to create economic prosperity?
I think there are different ways of moving value in the future with the next generation of payments, for example, around digital assets, and which is great. It's exciting to see so much innovation out there and so much development. And SWIFT is building a blockchain ledger, for example, to ensure that we can join up the current fiat payment system and the future, whether it be stablecoins, CBDCs, tokenized deposits. And so, for us, we see a priority to make sure that that is, as I say, all connected together, and that the global economy can function in a joined-up manner. And so that's certainly important. I think that development that we see is exciting, but it needs to be connected.
Tadashi, I'd like to come to you after this to sort of give us a view of how the private sector is looking at these issues. There are obviously constraints placed upon private companies just by nature of government policy making. And I'm curious as to what happens when perhaps your idea of economic resilience maybe looks different than that of policymakers. Have you seen that happen, and how do you sort of reconcile those differences if you have to at some points?
Well, obviously, the private sector is the main player, and they're very risk averse. Therefore, they're going to take a risk with the involvement of autocratic government. Therefore, that we need private sector needs the rule-based international order. There's three segments. One is goods and services. Two is capital flow. Three, more recently, that's digital asset flow. And then it's obvious that since 2016 that United States withdrew from the TPP negotiation. And then even the candidate from Democratic parties, Hillary Clinton, Hillary is also that not so enthusiastic about the TPP negotiation. The President Trump 45, he disregards that TPP. However, that promised arbitral initiative to make a CPTPP. This is based upon that malfunction of WTO. So that this is to try to encompass all the like-minded countries to build up new rule-based order, the goods and services. One thing, and very interestingly, China, also Taiwan, both apply to CPTPP. And besides original member, United Kingdom, after Brexit, United Kingdom applied, and then successfully, he is now the member. UK is now a member of CPTPP. This is a good thing, therefore, that this is a new phenomenon. And also on the set of the CPTPP, there's a digital trade, also that digital trade, because this is a new type of the frontier. And then the CPTPP and the digital asset is very coincident. And then those groups, and because of the initiative of Singapore and also that Chile, that the data traffic is also that now going to expand based on the rule of the CPTPP. And then, so the private sector is really needs those kind of framework of free to ensure that free trade of goods and services and digital and capital. And then my sense is, for example, that many years ago, China is also be a member of WTO, and also that in IMF that special drawing right SDR, the currency, the renminbi is also be a part of SDR component. However, there's no sign of the increase of the renminbi. For example, that's a central bank's reserve, foreign reserve. Renminbi's share is very small because the people in like-minded countries do not trust China. Therefore, renminbi is not anymore. That's also China now almost they change the course. They gave up some idea to be internationalization of renminbi in a normal course. But now China more shifted to that digital renminbi. So it's a new. So that will discuss later. But obviously that group like CPTPP or those framework for private sector is vitally important.
Thank you. So we also have a couple of Europeans on the panel, or at least a European and someone who's lived in Berlin for the last 20 years, as we were just talking about, and who works on China, works on economic security issues. So I want to bring the European focus into this conversation a little bit. And Noah, I want to start with you. You have a whole newsletter dedicated to how China and Europe are not necessarily working together, but how China interacts with Europe and how the economic relationship between the two is developing and has developed through the years. So how is Europe sort of responding or conceptualizing this idea of economic interdependence or economic weaponization, both at a member state level, but also at a supranational EU level? And are we looking, I mean, is this really just a China problem we're talking about here?
I would say it's mainly a China problem. Okay. I'm going to come out and say that. There is now a debate in Europe. We're at the very beginning of this debate about de-risking from the US. I think this is mainly rhetorical for now. We're not seeing a lot of action on that front. That could come. We'll have to see. The European Commission, I think, has been in the lead on this issue. They define economic security along 3 pillars: promote, protect, and partner. I think promote is about industrial policy and helping companies boost innovation and removing regulation. That's also a big debate in Europe right now. Partner is about free trade deals, diversifying trade. We have like the EU-India deal that was recently announced. I think the protect side is probably the most contentious. The European Commission announced an Industrial Accelerator Act recently, which is about introducing local content rules. It's about conditioning FDI. And this has been the subject of a very, very intense debate in Brussels. Trade defense is also quite contentious. We went through a very politically divisive debate in Europe about imposing tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. And so this is something that member states are wrestling with. I guess the other thing to say here is that, this is a new world in the sense that governments have to do things that they haven't been used to doing in recent decades. I liken it a bit to a pilot who has learned to fly a plane on autopilot. Now it's violent turbulence and the autopilot is not working anymore. And governments, but also companies, have to take control, manual control of the plane to prevent it from crashing. And I think some people are hoping the autopilot will go back on. Some people are overwhelmed by all the blinking lights and the buttons in the cockpit. So governments, this is very complex stuff. I think we see that with the issue of critical raw materials, where I think the Japanese have really been at the forefront through the creation of JOGMEC and responding to Chinese export controls back in 2010. this requires a new way of working between governments and companies. And for some, this comes a bit more naturally. I would say in Japan, there's a bit of a history of this. Where I am in Germany, I think we're struggling a bit to get that balance right.
I don't want to put you on the spot, but are Germany struggling to get the balance right? Are there any states within Europe who you look at and say they're getting this right and we should look at them as maybe a model to emulate?
Well, I always say that the Dutch or the Japanese of Europe, when it comes to economic security, I think they were very early in recognizing this issue, mainly because of the role of ASML and the pressure that they came under from the US to restrict the export of semiconductor manufacturing equipment to China. So I think the Dutch have moved to put economic security at the very top of the agenda. And you see that if you look at the Dutch ministries, there's economic security people everywhere.
Stormy, I want to come to you. You know, we've diagnosed some of the problems that we're facing here, and I know you've kind of talked about some potential solutions, and I want you to build those out. But I also want to ask you specifically. You know, I spend a lot of time thinking about what the EU was created for, and what it needs to do today, and what that transformation looks like, and how difficult it is. You know, and I look at sort of through the lens of the EU being a security actor, something that it was never meant to be. It was always created as this like normative power. In this age of, you know, economic fragmentation, multilateralism, economic coercion, does this mean that the EU itself needs to be more of an actor in this space rather than a body that is acted upon? And how do you think it is faring in that quest thus far?
Well, thank you so much for this really pertinent question and for also having us here today discussing these issues. I think before I hop into answering those multitude of questions which you just posed, what I always find helpful is just also to conceptualize a little bit what we are talking about. So this panel is about resilience and it's about economic security. And not always do we understand the same thing when we talk about these issues. So just to share my thoughts with you, what I think resilience is, it means identifying the risks with which we are confronted. And those risks are changing, and the interpretation and the awareness for it is changing. And that is something which is changing in the EU, and this is also something which is changing in Germany. For a long time, we believe that economic interdependence, trade, finances would lead to democratic change, would lead to stability, would lead to peace. And this comes from our own historical experience.